Hello and welcome to another edition of Between the Rows, the podcast of Glacier Farm Media. I'm this week's host, Gord Gilmour of the Manitoba Co-operator. On this episode, I get to sit down with a retiring great of agriculture journalism and talk about his career, some of the big stories he's covered, and some of the advice he has for the sector.
I think you have to try and at least be aware of what's out there in terms of the critic.
And reporter Geralyn Wichers speaks with an animal welfare consultant about how to balance science, interest groups, and the interests of producers.
There's nothing more elastic than animal welfare perception, I would say. So everybody has its own views of animal welfare.
But first, here's a word from our sponsor.
When you step foot on my farm, you become a part of it. I will tell you all about my land, what's working, what's not, as if we've spent our whole lives together. Our passion for farming makes us a community, and as part of that community, I want to see us all be successful, whether I'm working on your farm or with my job at Case IH. My name is Kelsey, I'm a farmer, and I work for Case IH.
Case IH, built by farmers.
1980 was a historic year. Terry Fox began his marathon of hope.
22-year-old Terry Fox is probably Canada's most famous athlete.
Keep up your courage. We're all behind you. The whole damn country.
A lot of people think I'm crazy doing this, but if you're happy, if I'm happy doing it and then I'm crazy, well, I'll be happy crazy.
Ronald Reagan was elected U.S. president.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And in rural Manitoba, Allan Dawson got his first media job as farm director for a local radio station. 2 years later, he'd become a reporter at the Manitoba Co-operator, and the rest is history. Allan recently retired. After 42 years in the business, spanning 5 decades, he's got a unique perspective on the agriculture sector and the forces that have shaped it over the years. He sat down with us to share some of these insights. Allan, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome.
I'm going to start by asking you if you ever imagined this career. Did you ever think that 42 years later you'd be retiring as one of the best agriculture journalists in the country?
Well, those are kind words, Gord. No, when I started out, I guess I didn't think that way. And initially, I wasn't even sure I would end up being a journalist or an ag journalist for that matter. Just kind of pursued what I really was interested in. But, the way it worked out was that I'd been working in the city for a few years, dropped out of university, and was working for the Department of Agriculture. And my wife and I, Joyce, wanted to move back to our home area near Miami, Manitoba. And I was interested in journalism, and a new radio station was starting up, and I thought I would give it a shot to see if I could get on there as a farm director. And I was successful.
So can you tell us a little bit then about what made you an agriculture journalist as opposed to a journalist? What was it that drew you to that field?
I was interested in agricultural journalism when I was at the Department of Agriculture, worked often with the communications people on the projects I was working on at the department to do with Dutch elm disease. And, I guess I think as a kid growing up and very young child, I remember being fascinated by journalism. I remember being at my grandparents' house when they were having a party, and they'd make a bed for me on the floor and put the radio in there for company, when I was falling asleep, 4 or 5 years old. And I just remember the glowing of that tube radio and the voice of the newsreader coming on. And I didn't really understand maybe what was the content of the broadcast, but the tone of the voice, I just knew that this was important. And growing up, I watched Front Page Challenge on CBC, and later on I was intrigued by these new documentary programs that came out in the late 60s, early 70s. This Hour Has 7 Days was in the 60s, and in the 70s, W5 on CTV, and later The Fifth Estate. And I was just intrigued by that stuff. In high school, I even did a project, essentially a radio project, where I did a survey of the school, crunched all the numbers, had a question that was actually about smoking rooms for students, which seems kind of weird, but and I did this survey, and as I say, crunched all the numbers and interviewed the principal and made this documentary. So I had an early interest in journalism, and to tell you the truth, maybe early on I didn't pursue it with a formal education. I was maybe afraid of failure. I wondered, if I'd even get accepted to go to journalism school, but I got into it through that radio station, and did a lot of freelance writing, that kind of thing as well, and carried on.
What were some of the most important stories that you covered during your career, in your view?
Well, Gord, it's sort of like, I bet you this is the same for you and other reporters. It seems like the story you're working on right at the current time is the most important, which, of course, you have to look back to get perspective. Broadly speaking, a lot of those important stories dealt with grain transportation, the Canadian Wheat Board debate, the marketing debate, but a couple of specific stories. One was involving Clemmer Seeds. A story was in 1993. It was a Saskatchewan company that ran into financial trouble, and I think it was mainly dealing in lentils, which weren't, I was going to say lentils, but it was a pulse crop that was not covered under the Grain Act, and I think lentils are now. But so just to shorten it up, the Grain Commission wasn't obliged to provide any security in that case because the crops involved were not covered under the Grain Act. But nevertheless, the minister of the day, the Federal Agriculture Minister, Bill McKnight, the government, and I think it was through the Grain Commission, awarded compensation to some farmers affected by that. And the story revealed allegations of concern about political interference, noting that the compensation wasn't required under legislation. And it raised a lot of questions. I'll tell you, at the time, I was quite worried. I was, still a relatively young reporter. It was almost 30 years ago, and treading into an area that I thought could, have a lot of minefields. But I had very good sources, like top people that knew the issue. So I was very convinced that the story had merit. And interestingly enough, nothing ever came of that. My fears about some sort of pushback or problems never came about. But that one really stood out for me. I did a lot of work on that, and I think it was an important story to note. As you gain experience in any field, you get more knowledge. So I was able to bring some of my own background knowledge to the story. And then I guess it was a desire to help better inform readers. It's one thing, just to deliver the 5 W's and sort of be a stenographer going to a meeting and sort of recapping what occurred. Some of these detailed stories, I think, need to be detailed because they're complex, and a lot of the readers won't have the background. They won't know how these things came about. And so I guess I'm motivated by adding value to the story, hopefully bringing information that can better inform the reader. And I take some pride in trying to do that.
One of the things I always kind of reflect on a little bit is that we're working here in a business, the agriculture sector, where there are a lot of what I would call characters. And I'm sure over the course of your career, you've met more than a few of them. Who are the ones that really stand out for you?
I've met a lot of sage farmers over the years, very insightful people and interesting people, funny people. And as you say, some are characters. But, a couple that really stand out for me would be Eugene Whalen and Jerry Ritz. Whalen, of course, a long time ago was a federal agriculture minister, and Jerry Ritz as well was more recently. And both of them, I would say, were characters in their own right. Eugene Whalen was a very folksy guy, had a great sense of humor and very dry wit. And he was kind of well known for his speaking style, which wasn't always grammatically correct.
The United States of America, that great free marketing system to the south of it, that's putting billions of dollars in. Nobody's saying anything about that. They're interfering in the marketplace with billions, setting aside, telling people to take acreage out of production, that type of thing, hoping to raise the prices. We say that's unchristian, that's unprincipled, unwarranted, shouldn't take place.
Give me your epitaph for Joe Clark.
My epitaph for Joe Clark. Well, I said the time they said, what'd they do to Joe? I said they spilled conservative guts and blood all the way from Come By Chance to Port Hardy.
And, with Jerry Ritz, such a witty man, very fast on his feet and just could, come up with these one-liners so easily, it seems.
Are there stories that you're still following over the course of your career that were there when you started?
The Canadian Wheat Board issue was there right from the start, the marketing issue. And of course, that's done now. That ended in 2012. Although, for some people, I guess notably the supporters of the Wheat Board, it's still a very sore point, but I think most people have kind of moved on. But other topics that are around now that were also in 1980, grain transportation. I mean, it's evolved. I would say that our grain handling and transportation system has improved immensely, but it's still maybe not where people would like to see it. And it's an ongoing debate around railway service and the power of the railways. Other things, regulations versus a laissez-faire approach to different things. It has always been there as long as I've been covering agriculture. Free trade. I would say now there's a consensus around that, but now with we're seeing pushback sort of in a general sense post-COVID. I guess COVID's not over, but in the wake of COVID, some people are, and all the supply chain issues, there's a lot of questions around how free will trade, how well will trade continue. But 5 years ago it was kind of an orthodoxy, but it's coming into question. But either way, trade is an ongoing one. So are things like supply management and farm subsidies. Those are just some of the things that come to mind that were issues in 1980 and are still issues now.
I suspect that there will be new issues that come along that kind of kick up debate again.
Well, biotechnology, I think, is an ongoing one. I think there's for the most part, a consensus around supporting various forms of biotechnology and plant breeding, but there's I would say some people have concerns around it. Trade. I think generally farmers support trade, but not all. And the view from the public and governments. We saw the Americans kind of retreating on trade and becoming more insular. Supply management's another one, fairly divisive, and again one that the Canadian public has views on. And I think things like the environment and greenhouse gas emissions and the role of agriculture, those are things to be watching too. Again, I think farmers generally are of a certain view on the environment, but governments and so on are anxious to try and get all sectors to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's going to be, I think, one that's going to be ongoing as well. Now, I might add too, Gord, that I would put out a bit of a warning or advisory to the industry about being in a bubble and just talking to each other. These echo chambers. Don't close yourself off. I think you have to try and at least be aware of what's out there in terms of the critics and so on, so that at least you can prepare. You don't want to be blindsided.
Well, Allan, that kind of wraps up what I wanted to say. One last question for you. What are you going to do with your newfound free time?
I don't think I'm going to have any trouble filling it. I was doing some stuff on the weekend, and it was such a pleasure to not have to be rushing. I was working on my electric fence that I use to keep the deer out of the garden. I still have some farmland with my sister that we rent out of the arable land for cropping, and we still have pasture, and I spend time fencing and that sort of thing. I like to golf, and I'm hoping to do a bit more of that, and reading and going to museums and baseball games and theater and spending time with my grandchildren and the rest of our family and friends. But I do hope to do some writing perhaps on some of the issues that I'm interested in. And again, maybe things that other reporters might not have the time to devote to, digging into them a bit more.
Well, Allan, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for taking a little time with us to reflect on your career.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. I appreciate it.
That was Allan Dawson, who's retiring after 42 years as an agriculture reporter. You're listening to Between the Rows, the podcast of Glacier Farm Media. I'm your host, Gord Gilmour of the Manitoba Co-operator. Have you ever wondered just how to talk about animal welfare? It's a difficult topic. People have strongly held views, and those views aren't always rational. Reporter Geralyn Wichers recently had the chance to talk to one consultant who's offering the sector some guidance on this issue. She joins us now with part one of her conversation with Stéphane Beaudoin, who spoke during a recent Canadian Centre for Food Integrity webinar.
I want to start out with asking you a little bit about what your company does. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I've actually ever heard. I'm sure there's plenty of these types of companies out there, but I'm not sure if I've ever come across one. So
I don't think there's plenty, to be honest.
Okay.
So what's particular about what we do is that in 2013, I decided to leave my nice corporate job in the pharmaceutical, working in corporate affairs and government affairs, and I was always interested in animal welfare, to be honest. And in 2007, with Elanco, we were working on animal handling because of some products that we were putting to the market back then. And I got to meet with Temple Grandin and get to know about the PACO organization. So it's the organization that certifies auditors for animal welfare. And I was getting a lot more kick in my work when I was doing stuff around animal handling, animal welfare. And back in those days, I was also seeing the need for the industry to kind of make sense of all this, what the science is requiring, what the interest groups are asking, what's the good thing to do, what's the right thing to do, how do we implement those programs, how do we assess them, and so on. So I decided to go on my own and get all my credentials for that. So the PACO certification, the animal welfare from Europe certification for slaughter plants and stuff like that. And slowly and gradually, I started to work on projects like implementing animal care program for the egg producers of Quebec and helping them putting the training together and do some assessment on transport. I also worked with the Canadian Livestock Transport Program as a trainer. Also had to work as an interim program manager, and I've organized training for the poultry sector in Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. So chicken haulers, catchers, transporters, slaughter plants. And through the associations in some of those provinces, we organize like group training where we would train 500 to 600 people a year to get those programs across and make the good news about animal welfare, about the standards, and getting people up to speed with the reality of it. So this is how I got to start in the business. And along the years, we try to make animal welfare front and central of everything we do. So from that angle, we do training, we do consultation, we do animal welfare assessment, some on our own as auditor, private auditors, some as subcontractor for large corporations, and we do those in Quebec naturally as well, depending on the scope. And in terms of animal welfare grids and animal food safety at the farm level, we manage are knowledgeable with around 35 or so audit schemes, so checklists. So we do Chicken Farmers of Canada, Turkey Farmers of Canada, mink farmers, cattle. What else? All of the federal group, we do them independently. And some with the international companies like NSF International, where we do subcontract for them, and we do farm to fork audits for them. So private grids, A&W, McDonald's, stuff like that we do as well. So
are there, besides, we're complying with the rules, how do we know that animal welfare is good? Are there ways to tell?
Yeah, well, there's a way to tell for sure. So in terms of there's nothing more elastic than animal welfare perception, I would say. So everybody has its own views of animal welfare. Some people will say that because they like animal more than others and because they feel for them and they do a bit of anthropomorphism in conveying their feelings or their assessment or their assessment of what good and bad is, and they think that animals think the same way. So there's these views. In animal welfare, what we try to do is to be as much objective as we can, and we rely more on the science of it. And we know that science is an evolutive matter. So what we think is good today might be different in a few years based on research, based on comparing peer-reviewed paper and some evidence, and also based on the context. So sometimes we're not necessarily looking for animal welfare that we used to look for in 1980, where we were more looking at the basic principles of the 5 freedoms. So trying to avoid hunger and thirst, avoid pain, avoid discomfort, avoid those things. Where we're evolving, we're optimizing the experience that those animals have and making sure that they are, I wouldn't use happy because this is not measurable, but that they are capable of doing what they are meant to do, what they were put, on this planet to do, and to do it in a pleasant way where they're not suffering and where they're getting most of it. So I think we based on your questions, are we doing good or bad? It depends on who calls the shot and who has its view on it. And I think the issue with the perception is that people are looking only at reality through the hole of a key lock sometimes, and they're looking tunnels and they forget about the big picture. So if I will take an example of sow stalls where they are individual crates. So we know that for the animal benefit, being always in a cage for perhaps 30% of the gestation. It's not the entire life of the animal, but for, let's say, a certain part of the gestation is perhaps not good. I mean, there's not enough activity, not enough stretching, but is it the cage that is the problem, or is it the size of the cage that might be an issue? Where also during this time, you want to make sure that you spot the return in heat of the animal. You want to make sure that if there's any abortion, we can spot it, we can address it, and take care of the animal. After they're recovering from farrowing, that's a place where we can better assess their heating habits, manage better their body weight, body scores, and so on. So if we were to let them loose and everything, then there's hierarchy in the pens, and some are eating more than others. So that can be managed too if we use technology, if we use implants or ways to trace or track those animals with the machine that knows exactly who's coming to the plate to eat. But again, even if we were in cages and a producer would decide to try to fix something, we could open the cages and make those animals walk a few minutes a day, stretch and move, and then bring them back in their places. So is it really the cage or how we manage it? So if there's good and bad in everything we do, but it's just a matter of trying to see what's the issue. If they're in cages and you see bruises or scars or anything like that, then there's an issue. If they're all looking great, then it means that the animal seems happy, it's eating properly, the behavior is there, you don't see aggression, you don't see aggressivity, you don't see depression, then it's a balanced thing. So I think when we're looking at animal welfare, we need to base it on science before we do anything. And the industry also is sensitive to that. And obviously, it's a matter of cost. It's a matter of opportunity. So when the standards are raising, when producers are giving the time to adapt to, then it means that they are doing it in equilibrium. They're able to invest, amortize their barns, be more profitable, be more sustainable, and then it's the whole thing. Animal welfare is not only the animal themselves looking at how they look in the cage, but we're also talking about the best feeding regimen that we can offer them, the best air quality we can give them, the best building we can give them. And if we put a lot of pressure in a short amount of time to some producer, then we put them out of business, or we prevent them to be sustainable and work on all the other animal welfare aspect that we can also improve. So animal welfare, I think, is if depending on what you want to focus on, you can see bad things. If you want to look at the big picture, I think overall we are improving if you compare to where we started, I believe.
And that was another thing that I want to ask. As in the talk where I first heard you speak, you talked about Canadian agriculture improving, and I was wondering if you could give me some more examples of some of those improvements.
Sure. I would say the first improvement that we've made over the years, I think if you were to look back 40 years ago, is that we do measure stuff now. So instead of saying that we do the best for animal and we care for them, therefore we're good people, then, I mean, the society and we have adapted and now we measure stuff. So if we're talking about animal, do they have enough space in their environment? Well, we measure densities. Animal densities in barns are way better today than there used to be, regardless of the barns that we're using, if they're going by the code. If you look at other stuff that we do measure now air quality, I mean, airflow. We know how many cubic feet per minute we need for the animals. I mean, we measure that. Temperature, it's all recorded. We have a lot of self-monitoring program in the barns that can adjust in seconds the quality of the air, the airflow, which we didn't have back then. If we focus on, let's say, feeding as well, now we have multiple phase eating program. It's all balanced. They eat like athletes. I mean, we know we balance what they eat more than what we do for ourselves when we're talking about animals, so that we don't waste the feed. Of course, I mean, there's a matter of economics in there, but also making sure the animal doesn't get too fat, doesn't get too thin, get the most out of it. And in terms of the animal husbandry as well. I think we've improved a lot in terms of physical alteration. So we do much less than what we used to do. We use painkiller now compared to the days where we would do castration without treating them. Dehorning, for instance, now there's some painkiller that we use for that. Beak treatment, we don't do that anymore. We do, for the most part, would be infrared on the tip of the beak, and it would fall like a dry nail without any pain or anything like that. So we do a lot of those things today with the conscious in mind that we want to avoid fear, stress, and pain from the animal. So I think without getting into the specifics of all the species, it's top of mind now to make sure that we improve on those.
You mentioned in your talk the need to be bold and transparent. Your talk was maybe more to a bit of more of a corporate audience than a farm-based audience. So I wanted to ask what that might look like at the farm level or the producer group level as well.
I think it addresses both. I mean, the producer groups association and also farmers as well. I think being bold and transparent, to me, doesn't mean to let anybody have access to any barn, anywhere, anytime. I mean, no business would tolerate that. I mean, if we're talking about any factory, you would not allow people to come in and walk around for worker safety purposes or anything like that. So same applies to animal welfare. So it's not. And farming, I mean, so it's not necessarily to the fact that we want to hide stuff, but we have restricted access zone, we have controlled access zone for biosecurity, regardless of who comes in. Even the producer themselves, they will dress up differently. They would use shoes covers and coveralls, and they actually don't bring anything from the outside. So having access is not a matter of transparency. I mean, transparency and boldness is to say, hey, farming and animal husbandry comes with animal handling. It comes with doing some things to make sure that the animals are okay. They don't hurt themselves more by, let's say, dehorning is an example, or that we used to do without any treatment. So I think we need to talk more about the practices, how we do it. That's what I mean in terms of boldness. So, and explain why we do it, and don't only and be transparent means don't only focus on what activists or any people would focus on, but say, give the big picture. Just like I told you, people don't tend to see animal welfare in other things than handling and husbandry. But when I'm talking about the feeding, when I'm talking about housing, when I'm talking about the climate control, when I'm talking about antibiotic use or reducing the antibiotic use, it means that in order to be able to reduce antibiotic use, we need to have much better husbandry. We need to have lower densities. We put less stress on the animals so that diseases don't show up as much. It means that we have better health program, better vaccination strategies, better herd management so that we avoid mixing different sources and stuff like that. So all that takes into account a lot around the wellness of the animal. And when I'm talking about transparency, it's not necessarily giving access to the farm to everybody, but say, hey, here's the big picture. I mean, try to see more than what you just focus on. Transport is an obligation where we're doing farming. So we do have to take animals from point A to point Z. But what we've improved over the years is the fitness to transport. Laws and regs are there, and producers have adhered to that. Truckers, which is not of their business, I mean, it's just taking any object from point A to point B, are now moving into the realization that, hey, these are sensitive beings, they have needs and so on. So our codes of practice are evolving and are keeping evolving. And being bold is talking about it. I mean, seeing an animal in the truck and thinking that they are in distress. Well, if they were in distress while they are transported, it would show up on the animal carcass. I mean, and I can tell you the story of any animal by looking at the carcass over the last at least 24 hours, and long-term lesion would tell me what type of suffering they would have had if they would have any, and it doesn't show up on the carcass. We have nice meat quality because they can sustain that. So, and in a truck, when it's very cold, there's a microclimate that expresses itself inside of the trailer. And believe it or not, we come to the slaughter plants and we don't see frost bites. We don't see issues. And if we see some, then we act on it, we report it, and we make sure that we do improve it. So being transparent, it's talking about openly about all the aspect of farming and about producing meat, and being able to and willing to have the discussion with that. But the thing is that most of the farming and farmers would be reluctant to talk about it because they feel guilty because of the pressure they have and they hear, and they perhaps don't want to engage in those situations because people get very emotional about it. And I mean, they have long days, and they don't need that on top of it to try to express and justify what they're doing. I mean, there's a lot of red tape around production. They are monitored. They are verified all the time. So if they were doing something bad, it would be caught and it would not go under the radar at all. So being bold and transparent is to openly talk about the reality of farming. And like I was saying in my suggestion, is to be smart about it. I mean, just don't argue for the sake of arguing, but try to find the proper channel and respond to those who are willing to hear about it and engage in the discussion.
Be sure to watch for the second part of that discussion during a later episode. And that's another edition of Between the Rows. I'm your host, Gord Gilmour, saying so long, and we hope you'll join us again next week.
When you step foot on my farm, you become a part of it. I will tell you all about my land, what's working, what's not, as if we've spent our whole lives together. Our passion for farming makes us a community, and as part of that community, I want to see us all be successful, whether I'm working on your farm or with my job at Case IH. My name is Kelsey, I'm a farmer, and I work for Case IH.
Case IH, built by farmers.